To save her brother from debt, she marries a cruel millionaire, but on their first night. I have a small favor to ask before we begin today's story. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. Meet Emily, a young woman barely scraping by, working at a small cafe, juggling debts, and doing everything she can to keep her family afloat. Things had never been easy for Emily, especially after her father passed away. The weight of her family's financial struggles weighed heavily on her shoulders, and every day felt like a battle she wasn't sure she could win. But she didn't have time to break down. Not when her brother, Alex, was deep in debt, a debt that was slowly swallowing him whole. The loan sharks were knocking on their door, threatening to take everything they had left. Emily knew she couldn't let that happen. She had to do something. That's when she received the call. It was from a man named Richard Blackwood, a name she didn't recognize, but one that struck fear into her heart when he said he had a way to help her brother. "Come to my office," he said. "I'll make you an offer you can't refuse." Desperation led Emily to the office of Richard Blackwood, a powerful CEO known for his cold, ruthless nature. He offered her a solution that seemed too good to be true. "Marry me," he said, his voice steady, eyes cold. "In exchange for your brother's debt to be cleared, I'll make you my wife. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." Emily was taken aback. Marry a man she didn't know, a man who seemed to have everything she could ever want, but with none of the warmth she needed? The idea was crazy, but her brother's life was on the line. What other choice did she have? The terms were clear. No love, no emotions, just a legal contract. She would help him secure his family's legacy, and in return, he would save her brother. She agreed, though the weight of her decision felt like a stone in her chest. But she had no idea how this contract would change her life forever. Little did she know, she was about to step into a world of wealth, power, and secrets that would test everything she believed in. The day she said, "I do," to Richard Blackwood, her life was about to be turned upside down in ways she never imagined. But on their first night as husband and wife, something unexpected happened. It wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. Something real started to stir between them. The cold, distant man she married seemed to have a different side, a side that made her question everything she had thought about him. Was this just the beginning of their contract, or could it be something more? Stay tuned, because the twists in this story are far from over. I know this wasn't what Emily expected when she agreed to marry Richard Blackwood, but here she was, standing in front of the grand mansion that would be her new home. The once bustling cafe, the place where she'd struggled day in and day out, felt like a distant memory now. This place, with its marble floors and gold fixtures, seemed like another world entirely. The house was cold, elegant, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a cage. Richard had kept his distance, barely acknowledging her as his wife. They had only exchanged a few words since their marriage ceremony, and all of those words had been about business, about the terms of their arrangement. He had made it clear, this wasn't about love. It was just about surviving. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Richard Blackwood than the cold, calculating man who had offered her a deal. There were moments when she thought she saw a glimpse of something else in his eyes, something that wasn't just business. Maybe she was imagining it, or maybe she wanted to believe it. But she couldn't deny that something was stirring inside her, a mixture of confusion and longing. Richard had told her from the start that this marriage was a business arrangement. He'd made sure she knew it wasn't about love or affection. But then, why did he keep looking at her like that? Why did his gaze linger just a little longer than necessary when she caught him staring? She didn't know the answers, but it didn't matter. She had made her decision. Her brother's debt was paid, and that was all that mattered. Or so she thought. That night, after a long day of meeting with his lawyers and handling business, Richard invited her to dinner. It was their first real meal together as husband and wife. And though the table was set beautifully with fine china and crystal glasses, the air between them was anything but warm. Richard was quiet, as usual, but tonight there was something different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Emily sat across from him, her hands nervously folding and unfolding her napkin. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to break the silence. Richard glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. Same as always, he replied, his voice flat. Business. I see, Emily said, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on her. She had expected this, had prepared herself for the coldness of their arrangement. But sitting here across from him, in the midst of this opulent dining room, she couldn't help but feel like she was suffocating. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if this wasn't just a contract? She asked quietly, before she could stop herself. Richard's eyes flicked to hers, his face expressionless. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Then, finally, he spoke. I don't have time for questions like that, Emily. This is a deal, nothing more. His words stung, but she didn't let it show. She nodded, looking down at her plate. She had known from the start that this was the reality she was walking into. This wasn't about love. This was about survival. But there was a part of her, a part she hadn't fully acknowledged before, that didn't want to accept it. She didn't want to be treated like a business transaction. And yet, as she sat there, she couldn't help but feel like she was just that, a transaction. After dinner, Richard stood up and excused himself, leaving her sitting alone at the table. Emily stayed behind, staring at the empty seat across from her. She wondered if this would ever feel real, if she would ever feel like she was truly part of this world, part of his world. She wanted to ask him about his past, about what made him so cold, but she couldn't bring herself to. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. She stood up and walked to the large window that overlooked the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, a world away from the quiet emptiness of the mansion. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and yet she didn't know how to escape. As the days passed, Richard and Emily's interactions remained largely the same. He would go off to his meetings, his business deals, and she would be left in the mansion, wandering through the empty halls. She would take long walks in the garden, but it was hard to enjoy the beauty of the place when it felt like she was in a gilded cage. The silence between them was suffocating. It wasn't that Richard was cruel, at least not in the way she had expected. He wasn't abusive or violent. He was just distant, cold, detached. And yet, as much as she tried to convince herself that she didn't care, there were moments when she couldn't help but wonder if things could be different. Could she break through the walls he had built around himself? Could she make him see that they weren't just a business transaction, that there could be more to this? But for now, all she had was the cold, silent mansion and the quiet man who had become her husband. The contract was clear, no love, no emotions. But what if that was starting to change? Was it possible that, even in the midst of all this, something real was beginning to grow? I know Emily never thought this would happen, but as the days turned into weeks, something inside her began to change. It was subtle at first, just a soft stirring in her chest when Richard was near. At times, she would catch him looking at her with something akin to curiosity, a fleeting moment where his cold exterior cracked just slightly. He still kept his distance, but there were small gestures, moments of softness that she didn't expect. Richard, for the first time in their marriage, invited her to accompany him to a charity gala. It was a lavish affair, filled with New York's elite, businessmen, and socialites, all mingling in the grand ballroom. Emily had never been to a place like this before, and she felt out of place in the sea of designer dresses and sharp tuxedos. But she pushed her insecurities aside, telling herself that this was just part of the deal, a part of the life she had agreed to live. She stepped out of the car, her heart racing as the reporters outside flashed cameras in their direction. She felt Richard's presence beside her, his hand gently brushing hers as they walked up the red carpet. It was all so surreal, so different from the life she had known. As they entered the ballroom, Emily's nerves were on edge, but she couldn't help but notice how Richard's hand never left her back. He was still distant, but in his own way, he was looking out for her. She had expected him to ignore her, to keep her at arm's length, but instead, he guided her through the crowd, introducing her to people with ease, as if she belonged in this world. The night wore on, and Emily couldn't help but notice that Richard seemed to be enjoying her company more than he had before. They shared quiet conversations, a few laughs, and even a slow dance, something that felt so intimate, yet so distant at the same time. He was still Richard Blackwood, the powerful CEO, but there was a side of him that she had never seen before. It was in the way he smiled at her when she made a joke, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, as if he were seeing her for the first time. By the end of the night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Maybe it was the elegance of the night, or maybe it was something else entirely. But for the first time since their marriage, she felt a spark, something real and undeniable. It was only later, when they were back in the quiet of their mansion, that Emily realized just how much she had been holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Richard could be more than just her business partner. She lay awake in bed that night, her thoughts racing. She had promised herself that this marriage would be nothing but a contract. But now, as she replayed the evening in her mind, she wondered if her heart had begun to change. And if it had, was it too late for her to admit it? Richard had been distant, yes, but now, she wasn't so sure. There was something there, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The next morning, Richard was gone again, off to his meetings, his coldness back in full force. Emily went through the motions of the day, preparing breakfast, cleaning the house, and keeping herself busy, but her mind kept drifting back to the gala, to the quiet moments they had shared. The distance between them felt even more pronounced now, as if he had returned to the man he had been before. She knew he wasn't the kind of man to show affection easily, but part of her wanted to believe that there could be something more. Maybe this wasn't just a marriage of convenience. Maybe, in his own way, Richard was starting to care. Or maybe she was fooling herself. But one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him, the way her heart raced when he looked at her, the way his touch lingered longer than necessary. She had made her decision to marry him, but now she was beginning to wonder if that decision had been the beginning of something more complicated than she had ever imagined. As the days passed, the uncertainty began to build inside her. She had never expected to feel this way about him, but here she was, questioning everything. She had entered into this arrangement with no expectations, but now, she couldn't deny that something was growing between them. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? Or was it all just a game, a facade, something he had perfected to get what he wanted? And if it was, could she live with that? For the first time, Emily didn't have the answers. She only knew that the lines between contract and reality were starting to blur, and she wasn't sure where this path would take her. But she knew one thing for sure. Her feelings for Richard were no longer just a business arrangement. They were something deeper, and that terrified her. Emily couldn't shake the thoughts that had taken root in her mind after the gala. The touch of Richard's hand on her back, the way his eyes seemed to linger a little longer than they should, and the soft smiles he offered when their conversation veered away from business. Everything seemed to hint at something more. She tried to focus on the reality of their situation, reminding herself that this marriage was only a contract, that it was never meant to be about love. But deep down, she knew that things were changing, and she didn't know how to stop it. The days went by, and Richard continued to keep his distance. He was always busy, always working, and Emily spent most of her time in the mansion, trying to adjust to the luxury that surrounded her. She had never lived this way before, and while she couldn't deny the comfort of it, it felt hollow. There were no friends, no laughter, no warmth, just cold, empty rooms and a man who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It wasn't until the evening of their second week as husband and wife that Emily's thoughts would be put to the test. Richard came home late, as usual, but this time, there was something different about him. He wasn't his usual, distant self. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made Emily's heart skip a beat. "I need to talk to you," Richard said, his voice low but urgent as he walked into the living room where Emily was reading. Emily looked up, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" she asked, trying to hide the nerves in her voice. Richard hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I've been thinking," he started, pacing slowly across the room. "About this marriage, about us." Emily's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything would finally be addressed. But what if it wasn't what she hoped for? What if he wanted to end the arrangement? "What about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard stopped pacing and turned to face her, his gaze piercing. "This contract," he said, gesturing between them. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything beyond business, but the more I think about it, the more I realize maybe it's not that simple." Emily felt a flutter in her chest. Was he admitting that he felt something too? Or was this just another way for him to reassert control over the situation? She didn't know. "I don't know what's happening, Emily," he continued, his voice softer now. I didn't expect to care about you, and I certainly didn't expect to want more than just this arrangement. But something is changing, and I can't ignore it. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was racing. Was he really saying what she thought he was? Was this the moment she had been waiting for? I don't know what this means yet, Richard said, stepping closer to her. But I think we need to stop pretending this is just business. Emily stood there, frozen, unsure of how to react. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Was this the beginning of something real, something that could break through the walls Richard had built around himself? Or was this just another game he was playing? I'm not asking for anything yet, Richard added, his voice calm but earnest. But I need you to know that I'm not the same man I was when we first got married. And I think there's more to this than I realized. Emily looked at him, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had spent so long convincing herself that this marriage was only a means to an end, that there was no room for emotions, no room for love. But now, Richard was telling her something she hadn't expected, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about him, and about herself. Could she allow herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Richard Blackwood wasn't as cold and heartless as she had assumed? Could she allow herself to believe that there was a possibility of something real growing between them? Or was she setting herself up for heartbreak? She didn't know the answer. But what she did know was that everything had changed in that moment. Richard's words, his vulnerability, had opened a door inside her heart that she hadn't even known was there. And now, as they stood in the quiet of the living room, she was faced with a choice that could change the course of her life forever. Emily stood there, frozen, as Richard's words echoed in her mind. She had spent weeks, months even, convincing herself that this marriage, this life, was just a business deal. There was no room for emotions, no room for love. But now here was Richard, telling her he felt something more, something real. It was a confession, but it also felt like a challenge, a test. Could she let her guard down, or would she keep hiding behind the walls she had built? Her heart raced as she tried to process everything. For the first time since their wedding, Emily felt the weight of the situation shift. It wasn't just a marriage anymore. It was something else, something that she didn't know how to define. Richard stood before her, his gaze steady but full of uncertainty. He had admitted something he hadn't planned on admitting, and now the ball was in her court. I don't know what to say, she finally whispered, her voice barely above a breath. You don't have to say anything yet, Richard replied, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. I just wanted you to know. I needed you to know that I'm not the same man I was when we first married. And maybe you're not the same either. Emily felt her chest tighten as the words sank in. Could she allow herself to believe that? Could she believe that there was a possibility of something more than a contract between them? Could she open her heart to the possibility of love? She didn't know, but there was a part of her that wanted to believe it. But then the reality of their situation hit her. They had built this life on a lie, on a contract that was meant to keep emotions out. What if she let her feelings show, only to find that Richard was still the man he was when they first met? What if this was all just another game to him? Richard's next words made her hesitate. I'm not asking for anything, Emily, he said, as though reading her mind. I just need you to know where I stand. I'm not asking you to feel the same way, but I can't keep pretending like nothing's changing. Emily looked at him, her heart torn. The last thing she wanted was to get hurt, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him, the way her heart fluttered when he looked at her, the way his touch lingered longer than necessary. She had been so afraid of letting him in, of letting herself care for him, but now she wasn't sure she could keep up the walls. I don't know if I'm ready for this, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Richard took a step closer to her, his eyes softening. You don't have to be ready right now, he said gently. We don't have to rush this. But I just want you to know that you're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'm willing to try. Whatever this is between us, I want to see where it goes. His words were like a balm to her heart, but they also left her with more questions than answers. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? Could this ever be real? As Richard reached for her hand, Emily couldn't help but feel the warmth of his touch. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new, something she had never expected. The next few days were a blur. Emily found herself watching Richard more closely, noticing the small ways he had changed. He seemed more open, more vulnerable, and for the first time, he was letting her in. They spent more time together, talking about everything and nothing, sharing meals, and even sharing quiet moments in each other's company. But even with all of this, there was still a part of her that held back. She didn't want to give in too easily, didn't want to let her emotions run wild only to find out that Richard was still the same man he had been when they first met. She had to protect herself, but it was getting harder. As the days passed, Emily began to notice something else, something that made her heart race even more. She was beginning to see the man behind the suit, the ruthless CEO who had been hiding behind his cold exterior. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the uncertainty in his gestures, and the kindness in his actions. He was still distant, still a man of business, but there was something more beneath the surface. And as she began to see more of that side of him, she couldn't help but wonder if she was falling for him. But falling in love with Richard Blackwood was dangerous. She knew that. She had to remind herself of the rules of their marriage. There were no feelings involved, just a contract. But what if that was changing? What if the line between contract and reality was starting to blur? Emily didn't know what the future held, but she knew that things were no longer as simple as they once seemed. And as she lay in bed that night, her thoughts consumed by Richard, she couldn't help but wonder if this marriage, this arrangement, had become something more than just a way to save her brother. Could it be a way to save herself too? As the days went by, Emily felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing between the reality of her contract marriage and the emotions that had started to grow inside her. Richard's words, the small gestures, the way he had opened up to her, it all felt so different from the cold, distant man she had married. Yet, as much as she wanted to believe that this was real, she couldn't forget the foundation their marriage was built on. It was a contract, nothing more, and she had to keep reminding herself of that. But it was getting harder to ignore the changes she saw in Richard. The more time they spent together, the more she realized that there was so much more to him than just the ruthless CEO. He wasn't just the man who had offered her a business deal to save her brother. He was also the man who had cared for her when she was vulnerable, the man who had shared his thoughts and fears with her in moments of honesty. It confused her. Every time she thought she had figured him out, something else would surface, something that made her wonder if he was truly opening up to her, or if he was still hiding behind a mask. It was late one evening when things finally reached a boiling point. Richard had invited her to a quiet dinner at home, something they hadn't done in a while. It was a rare moment of peace in their otherwise busy lives, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. As they sat at the dinner table, the conversation felt different this time. There was no talk of business, no mention of the deal they had made. For once, it felt like they were just two people, sharing a meal together. "How was your day?" Richard asked, his voice unusually soft. Emily was taken aback by the genuine concern in his tone. She smiled, trying to keep her emotions in check. "It was good," she replied, though she couldn't help but notice the way Richard was watching her, his eyes more intense than usual. She felt a flutter in her chest, and it took everything she had to keep her composure. "I've been thinking," Richard said after a long pause, his voice low, "about us, and about this marriage. I know it started as a contract, but I can't help but feel like it's becoming something more." Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had waited for him to say this, but now that it was happening, she didn't know how to respond. The words she had rehearsed in her mind all seemed to escape her, leaving only silence between them. Richard reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "I'm not saying it's easy," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we could make this work. If you want." Emily's mind raced. Could this really be happening? Could Richard Blackwood, the man who had been so distant and cold, actually want something more than just a business arrangement? The man who had built walls so high, it felt impossible to break through. Was he finally ready to tear them down? She didn't know. She couldn't know for sure. But in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something different. It wasn't just the businessman she had married. It was the man who had allowed himself to be vulnerable with her. The man who was offering her something that went beyond their original deal. For a moment, she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. Maybe this was the chance she had been waiting for. Maybe this was the beginning of something real. She squeezed his hand gently, trying to steady her racing heart. "I don't know what this means," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm willing to try. I want to believe in this, Richard. I want to believe in us." A small smile tugged at the corner of Richard's lips, and Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. He stood up from the table, pulling her into a hug, and for the first time since their wedding, she felt like they were on the same page. Like they were more than just a contract. They were two people who were willing to take a chance on each other. "I promise you, Emily," Richard whispered into her ear. "This is just the beginning." The next few weeks were filled with quiet moments like this, small, intimate gestures that spoke volumes. Richard continued to show more of himself to her, and Emily couldn't help but feel herself falling deeper into this unexpected relationship. It was slow, and there were still moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if this was all too good to be true. But with every passing day, she realized that maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe love wasn't something that could be forced or planned. Maybe it was something that happened when you least expected it. As she lay in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, Emily thought about everything that had happened. She had entered this marriage with no expectations, just a promise to save her brother. But now, she was beginning to realize that her feelings for Richard were real. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to feel the same way. It was scary, uncertain, and confusing, but for the first time in a long time, Emily wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew that she was willing to find them, together with Richard. As the days went by, Emily found herself more and more tangled in the emotions that had begun to bloom between her and Richard. She had entered this arrangement with no expectations, no illusions, just a way to save her brother and protect what little family she had left. But now, with every passing day, she could no longer deny it. She was starting to care for him, deeply. And Richard, despite his cold and calculating exterior, seemed to be changing too. His gestures, his smiles, the way he'd open up to her in private, were all signs that something more was beginning to develop. He was no longer the man she had married in a cold, businesslike ceremony. He was someone who was beginning to let her in. The night had been calm when Richard came home late again. Emily had been sitting on the couch, lost in thought, when she heard the sound of his footsteps in the hall. He looked tired, more so than usual, his suit slightly disheveled. But there was a weariness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. He walked into the living room and stopped in front of her, his gaze meeting hers. "I've been thinking," Richard began, his voice low and uncertain. Emily looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. This wasn't like him. He was always so composed, so controlled, but now he seemed vulnerable. "About what?" Emily asked, her voice soft, not sure what to expect. Richard hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, he sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, but far enough to still keep a distance. "About us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Was this it? The conversation she had been avoiding, the one she had been scared to have? She swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "What about us?" she asked, her voice betraying the anxiety she felt deep down. Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I know this started as a business arrangement," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But it's not just that anymore. I think we've both changed." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Was he really admitting what she thought he was? Was this the moment where everything she had feared, yet secretly hoped for, was coming true? "I'm not asking for anything," Richard continued, his eyes searching hers for something. "But I want to know if you feel the same. If you believe this could be more than just a contract, more than just a deal." Emily didn't know what to say. The words were stuck in her throat, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. The man she had married for a deal, the man who had kept his distance, was now asking her if she thought there was a possibility of something real between them. It was more than she had ever hoped for, but it was also terrifying. She had promised herself that she wouldn't get attached, that she wouldn't let her emotions get in the way of the arrangement. But now, standing on the precipice of something she couldn't control, Emily didn't know if she was ready to take that step. She had spent so long guarding her heart, protecting herself from getting hurt. Could she really let go of that fear? Could she really trust Richard, knowing everything she had been through? The silence between them stretched on, thick with uncertainty. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I don't know, she said honestly. I want to believe that this is more than just a deal, that maybe we could be more than just a contract. But it's hard. You're right, we've both changed. But I don't know if I can let go of everything I've been holding on to. Richard reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm, as though he was trying to anchor her in the moment. I'm not asking you to forget everything, he said softly, but I am asking you to give this a chance. To give us a chance. Emily looked at him, his gaze full of sincerity, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the businessman. She saw the vulnerability, the uncertainty, and maybe, just maybe, she saw the man who was willing to take a risk on her. She didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, she realized that she was ready to try, ready to take the leap into the unknown, to give this marriage, and maybe even their love, a chance. Okay, Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. Okay, I'll try. I'm willing to see where this goes. Richard smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. She didn't know where this journey would take them, but for the first time since their marriage, she felt like they were on the same path. A path that was uncertain, but full of possibilities. As Richard leaned in and kissed her gently, Emily felt something stir inside her. A hope, a longing, that maybe, just maybe, their contract had become something far more powerful than either of them could have imagined. Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her as Richard kissed her gently, but it wasn't the kind of peace that came from certainty. It was more like the quiet before a storm, the calm that lingered just before everything she had ever known would change. They had made a promise to each other that night, a promise that they would let go of the walls they had built around themselves, and give their marriage a real chance. But the next morning, reality came crashing back. Richard had to leave for a business meeting early, and Emily was left alone in the mansion once again. The grand halls, the polished floors, the silence, it all felt so isolating. But she had promised herself that she wouldn't let fear dictate her actions anymore. She was determined to make this work, to find out if what they shared could turn into something real. As the day passed, Emily found herself thinking about their conversation the night before. Richard had shown her a side of himself that she never expected, a side that was vulnerable, honest, and human. He had admitted that he was unsure of his feelings, unsure of where this would go, but for the first time, he was willing to risk it. And that, she realized, was the most important thing. He was willing to try. Emily had always been the one to put others' needs before her own, always the one to sacrifice for the people she loved. But now, with Richard, she had to ask herself if she was willing to sacrifice her own fears, her own doubts, for the chance of something more. Could she truly let go of the past and embrace the possibility of love? Or was she just fooling herself, hoping for something that would never come? That evening, Richard returned home, and there was something different in the way he looked at her. His eyes held a warmth, a tenderness that hadn't been there before, and it made her heart race. As they sat down for dinner, they spoke about everything and nothing, about their day, about the small moments that made them laugh, about things that weren't about business or obligation. And for the first time, Emily realized that they were no longer just two people playing a role in a contract. They were two people getting to know each other, slowly, but surely, and it felt real. I'm glad you're here, Richard said quietly, breaking the silence between them. I didn't think I'd ever want this. I didn't think I'd ever want to be this open with anyone. Emily smiled softly, her heart swelling in her chest. Me too, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought this would be possible. Richard looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing his next words carefully. I know we've made some mistakes along the way, he said, his tone sincere. But I want to make it right. I want to be someone you can rely on, someone you can trust. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. Was this the moment she had been waiting for? The moment when everything finally clicked? She could see it in his eyes, the sincerity, the vulnerability, and for the first time, she believed that he wasn't just saying these words to appease her. He meant them. I think we both deserve a chance at happiness, Richard continued, his voice gentle. Not just because of the deal we made, but because we're starting to understand each other. And I'm willing to take that chance, Emily. Are you? Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had spent so long keeping her distance, keeping her heart locked away, but now, in this moment, she realized that maybe it was time to let go. Let go of the fear, the doubts, and take a chance on something that felt so new, so uncertain. But maybe that was the point. Maybe life wasn't about certainty. Maybe it was about taking risks, about letting yourself be vulnerable, and trusting that the person standing beside you would catch you when you fell. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm ready to take that chance with you." Richard's face lit up with a smile, the warmth in his eyes deepening. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and for the first time, Emily didn't feel like she was playing a role. She felt like she was finally, truly living. In the days that followed, Emily and Richard continued to navigate this new chapter of their lives. There were still moments of uncertainty, still questions about where their relationship would go, but there was also something new, something that neither of them had anticipated. There was trust, there was honesty, and most importantly, there was a sense of partnership that had been missing before. They had moved past the cold, business-like contract that had initially bound them, and now they were building something stronger, something real. It wasn't perfect. There were still obstacles to overcome, challenges they would have to face together, but Emily realized that she wasn't alone anymore. Richard was there, standing beside her, ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She didn't know what the future held, but with Richard by her side, she was ready to find out. They were no longer just two people tied together by circumstance. They were a team, and that made all the difference. As time went on, Emily and Richard found a rhythm that felt natural, despite the unexpected start to their relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but they were learning how to navigate their new life together. For Emily, every day felt like a new discovery. She was no longer living in the shadow of the contract that had initially bound her to Richard. Now, they were building something real, something that wasn't based on obligation but on choice. The vulnerability they had shared with each other made their bond stronger. She could feel it in the way Richard looked at her now, in the quiet moments where they didn't need to say anything to know that they were there for each other. It was a kind of understanding that went beyond words. One evening, after a long day, Richard surprised her with a simple gesture, a candlelit dinner in the garden. It was just the two of them, no business deals, no distractions, just the flickering light of the candles and the soft sounds of the night. "I've been thinking about us," Richard said, as they sat down at the table. Emily looked up from her plate, meeting his gaze. "About what?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Richard smiled, but it wasn't a business smile. It was one that reached his eyes, that softened his features. "About how far we've come," he said quietly. "How we've gone from being strangers tied together by a contract to, well, to this." He gestured between them, his hand hovering in the air, as if trying to capture the meaning of it all. Emily's heart swelled. It was in moments like this that she realized how much things had changed, how much she had changed. "I never thought I'd be sitting here, with you, like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came into this marriage expecting nothing more than a way to save my brother, but now—" She trailed off, not sure how to put her feelings into words. Richard reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know," he said softly. "I came into this with my own walls up, expecting nothing more than business, but now I feel differently." They sat there for a while, in the quiet, just holding hands. For the first time, Emily felt that everything was right, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. It wasn't perfect, and they still had challenges ahead, but they had come a long way from where they started. And in that moment, Emily knew that she was no longer just in this marriage to fulfill a contract. She was here because she wanted to be, because she had found something real, something worth holding on to. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened. They had moments of laughter, moments of silence, and even moments of tension, but they always worked through it together. It wasn't about perfection. It was about understanding, about giving each other the space to grow, both as individuals and as a couple. One afternoon, a few months after that dinner, Richard surprised Emily again. This time, he wasn't waiting with a lavish dinner or grand gesture. Instead, he had a simple piece of paper in his hand, a new contract. But this time, it wasn't a business deal. It was a new agreement, a promise. "I want us to have a real chance, Emily," Richard said, handing her the paper. "I want us to have a future, not just as business partners, but as partners in every sense of the word. Emily took the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at it and realized that this wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of everything they had been through, everything they had built together. "I want this too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want a future with you." They didn't need the paper to define their relationship. They had already defined it together, through the choices they made and the love they had built. But in that moment, with the promise in his hand, it was a final affirmation that what they had was real. As time went on, Richard and Emily grew stronger as a couple. They worked together, laughed together, and faced the world together, side by side. Emily had started this journey thinking she was trapped in a contract, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. And as they stood together at the balcony, looking out over the city that had witnessed the start of their journey, Emily realized that home wasn't just the mansion or the wealth they had. It was the bond they had formed, the trust they had built. Home was with Richard, where love, understanding, and partnership thrived. And for the first time, Emily felt a sense of peace that she had never known before, knowing that this was just the beginning of their story, a story of love, redemption, and a future filled with endless possibilities.